The air at the St. Regis Grand Ballroom shimmered thick with the scent of money and Chanel No. 5. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of couture gowns and bespoke tuxedos at the annual Vanguard Foundation Gala. For Elara Thorne, this glittering world had become a beautiful cage. She stood beside her husband, the magnate Julian Thorne, a perfect porcelain doll on his arm. But under the polite smiles and the flash of camera bulbs, a storm was brewing. No one in that room could have predicted that within the hour, the velvet ropes and champagne flutes would become the backdrop for a brutal act of humiliation that would shatter a dynasty and ignite a war no one saw coming. The weight of the Thorne diamond necklace felt like a collar on Elara's neck. Each of the 24 flawless diamonds, a personal gift from her husband Julian for her 24th birthday, seemed to absorb the light and warmth of the room, leaving her feeling cold. She ran a gloved finger over the largest stone, a perfect pear-cut centerpiece. Julian had called it the Tear of Elysium. Tonight it felt prophetic. Julian Thorne was not just a man. He was an institution. The CEO of Thorne Industries, a global logistics empire he had inherited and ruthlessly expanded. He moved through the gala like a shark in its own aquarium. People parted for him. Voices hushed. His smile, a brilliant flash of white, rarely reached the cold, calculating blue of his eyes. And for 10 years, Elara had been his most prized acquisition. She had met him when she was a promising architectural student, full of dreams of designing sustainable public spaces. He'd been a guest lecturer at her university. Powerful, charming, and utterly captivating. He'd swept her off her feet, promising her the world. And he had delivered it piece by gleaming hollow piece. Her dreams of architecture were gently put aside, replaced by the full-time job of being Mrs. Thorne charity boards, social events, and managing their sprawling estates in the Hamptons and Lake Como. "Darling, you look breathtaking," Julian murmured, his hand possessively on the small of her back. His touch was no longer a comfort. It was a brand. "Senator Davies is waving us over." "Smile." Elara produced a smile. It was practiced perfect and didn't touch her own eyes. She felt a familiar prickle of unease as they approached the senator's table. In recent months, Julian's affection had cooled to an Arctic frost. His compliments felt like commands, his presence an exercise in surveillance. The late-night board meetings and unexplained weekend trips had become more frequent. She wasn't naive, but she had clung to the hope that it was a phase, a symptom of the immense pressure he was under. As Julian engaged the senator in a deep discussion about shipping tariffs, Elara's gaze drifted across the ballroom. And then she saw her, Isabella Vance. She was a junior PR executive at Thorne Industries, a woman who seemed to be made of sharp angles and ambition. Her dress was a slash of crimson silk that clung to her like a second skin, a stark, audacious statement in a room of elegant pastels and classic blacks. Her laughter, loud and throaty, cut through the polite murmur of the crowd, and it was directed at Julian. Across the room, Julian's eyes met Isabella's. It was a fleeting glance, but it contained a universe of secrets. A shared joke, a spark of intimacy, a silent promise. The cold dread in Elara's stomach solidified into a certainty that was as hard and unforgiving as the diamonds around her neck. This wasn't just a dalliance. This was something more. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She needed air. Excusing herself with a quiet murmur, she made her way towards the terrace, her satin gown rustling against the marble floors. The whispers followed her. "Doesn't she look divine? The perfect couple. He adores her." The words were like tiny, poisonous darts against her skin. On the terrace, the cool night air was a relief. She leaned against the balustrade, looking out over the city lights that glittered like a fallen constellation. She had given up everything for him. Her name, her career, her very identity had been subsumed into his. She was no longer Elara Sterling, the bright young architect. She was Elara Thorne, an accessory. A shadow fell over her, hiding from the adoring public. She turned. It was Isabella Vance. Up close, her beauty was almost aggressive. Her makeup was flawless, her dark hair styled in a severe chic bob. Her smile was a predatory slash of red lipstick. "Just getting some air," Elara replied, her voice more steady than she felt. "It's a wonderful party, isn't it?" Isabella said, her eyes scanning Elara's dress, her jewelry, with a look that was part envy, part appraisal. "Julian has such impeccable taste. In everything." The insinuation was as subtle as a sledgehammer. Elara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "My husband is a man of high standards, yes?" Isabella laughed, that same throaty sound from across the ballroom. "Oh, I know. He's been telling me all about his standards. He says he's looking to divest from certain assets that are no longer providing a return." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Face it, Elara, your stock has plummeted. You're a relic from a bygone era in his life, the dutiful little wife. Men like Julian don't want to be dutiful. They want exciting." Every word was a calculated strike designed to wound. Elara felt a surge of fury, hot and sharp, cutting through her shock. "And I suppose you're an exciting new venture." "I'm the future," Isabella stated, her arrogance absolute. "He's just waiting for the right moment to tell you. But I thought I'd give you a heads up. A woman-to-woman courtesy." The courtesy was a declaration of war. Before Elara could formulate a response, Julian appeared at the terrace doors. His face, which had been a mask of public affability, was now dark with irritation. "Elara, what are you doing out here?" "Senator Davies was asking for you." He saw Isabella, and his expression flickered for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of annoyance that she was there. "Isabella, back to the floor." "Of course, Julian," Isabella said, giving Elara a triumphant little smirk before gliding away. Julian turned his full frigid attention to his wife. "What were you two talking about?" "She was just complimenting the party." Elara lied, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Don't lie to me," he hissed, his voice dangerously low. "I saw your face. You're making a scene." "I'm making a scene," she whispered, incredulous. "Julian, she practically told me you two are..." "Enough!" He snapped, his grip tightening on her arm. "You are my wife. You will stand by my side, you will smile, and you will not embarrass me. Is that understood?" The pressure on her arm was painful. "This conversation is over. We are going back inside." He didn't wait for her reply. He began to pull her back towards the ballroom doors, his fingers digging into her flesh. She stumbled, trying to regain her footing and her dignity. This was the moment she should have screamed, should have fought back. But a decade of conditioning of being the placid, perfect Mrs. Thorne had stolen her voice. She allowed him to lead her back into the glittering cage, her mind reeling, completely unaware that the polite performance was over and the true, brutal spectacle was about to begin. The return to the ballroom was a surreal blur. The orchestra swelled, playing a soaring waltz, but to Elara it sounded like a funeral dirge. The glittering lights of the chandeliers seemed to mock her, illuminating the charade she was forced to play. Julian's hand was a manacle on her arm, his smile a rictus of civility, pasted on for the benefit of their audience. He guided her back to their table, where a circle of business titans and their wives greeted them with oblivious pleasantries. "There you are." "We were just saying, Julian, you have the most beautiful wife in New York," boomed Marcus Blackwood, a shipping rival with a booming voice and a disingenuous smile. "I'm a lucky man." Julian said the words, tasting like ash in Elara's mouth. He squeezed her arm again, a silent command. "Play along." Elara forced another smile, her facial muscles aching from the effort. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, yet she had never felt more invisible. She was a ghost at her own feast, watching her life crumble from a distance. Her gaze kept darting towards Isabella, who was now holding court near the bar, laughing with a group of younger executives, occasionally flicking her eyes towards their table with undisguised contempt. The gala's host, a famed philanthropist, took the stage to begin the charity auction. Item after item went for astronomical sums a week on a private yacht, a Picasso sketch, a bespoke sports car. Julian, ever the showman, entered a bidding war for a rare bottle of 1945 Romanée Conti wine, driving the price up to $250,000 with a flick of his wrist. The room applauded his largesse. Elara felt sick. It was all a game, a display of power and dominance. He wasn't buying wine, he was buying adoration. It was during the final auction item, a private concert with a world-renowned pianist, that Julian leaned in close, his breath warm and laced with expensive whiskey. "I need to have a word with my CFO. Stay here. Don't move." It wasn't a request. He stood and walked away, not towards his CFO, but directly towards the bar, where Isabella was standing. Elara watched, frozen, as he placed a hand on the small of Isabella's back, the exact same gesture he had used on her all night. But this time it was different. It was intimate, familiar. Isabella leaned into him, whispering something in his ear. Julian threw his head back and laughed, a genuine, uninhibited laugh that Elara hadn't heard directed at her in years. The sight was a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs. The polite fiction they had maintained all evening, all year, was shattered by that single public gesture. The whispers around the table died down. Heads began to turn. Marcus Blackwood's wife, Catherine, gave Elara a pitying look that was worse than any insult. This was it. The public execution Isabella had promised. Fueled by a sudden reckless surge of adrenaline and a decade of suppressed rage, Elara stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the momentary lull. She had to know. She had to hear it from him. She walked on trembling legs across the ballroom, her path a straight line to her husband and his mistress. The room seemed to fade into a tunnel with only the three of them at the end. As she approached, she could hear Isabella's syrupy voice. "So I told him if he wants the Apex account, he'll have to go through me. And Julian, darling, you should have seen his face." "Julian!" Elara's voice was a ragged whisper. They both turned. Julian's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. The affable CEO vanished, replaced by the cold tyrant she knew in private. Isabella's expression was one of pure venomous triumph. "What do you think you're doing?" Julian snarled under his breath, trying to keep his voice low, but the anger was palpable. "I want to go home," Elara said, her voice shaking but firm. "Now." "We'll go home when I say we go home," he retorted. "You are making a spectacle of yourself. Go back to the table." "No," she said, the word feeling foreign and powerful on her tongue. I will not sit there and be humiliated. Not anymore. Isabella chose that moment to twist the knife. She looped her arm through Julian's, pressing herself against his side. Darling, I think your wife is feeling a little overwhelmed. Maybe she needs a glass of water, or a new life. The blatant possessiveness, the casual cruelty of the gesture finally broke something inside Elara. All the years of biting her tongue, of smoothing things over, of accepting his coldness as a byproduct of his genius, it all evaporated in a blaze of white-hot anger. "Get your hands off my husband," Elara said, her voice low and trembling, with a rage she didn't know she possessed. Julian's face went dark. "You've lost your mind." He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "You are leaving, now!" He started to pull her towards the exit, but she resisted, trying to wrench her arm free. "Let go of me, Julian." Her resistance seemed to flip a switch in him. The last vestiges of his public control snapped. In front of the silent, staring elite of New York City, Julian Thorne, the titan of industry, lost his composure. "You want to leave?" he roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. The music stuttered to a halt. "Fine, we'll leave." He released her wrist, but only for a second. In a move of shocking primitive brutality, he tangled his hand in her carefully coiffed hair, grabbing a fistful of her long, dark locks near the scalp. A collective gasp went through the ballroom. Elara cried out a sharp sound of pain and disbelief. The pull was agonizing, sending shooting stars of fire across her scalp. He began to drag her. He dragged her past their table, past the horrified faces of their friends and business associates. He dragged her across the gleaming marble floor, her satin shoes skidding her gown, twisting around her legs. The Thorn diamond necklace swung wildly, its cold weight choking her. Camera flashes, once a glamorous backdrop, now exploded in her face like strobing accusatory spotlights. It was a nightmare made real. Each step was a fresh wave of agony and abject shame. Her world narrowed to the searing pain in her head, the rough feel of the carpet as she stumbled from the marble, and the sound of her own ragged breathing. And through it all, one sound cut through her haze of pain and humiliation. It was laughter, clear, high, and triumphant. She twisted her head, her neck screaming in protest, and saw Isabella Vance standing by the bar. Her arms were crossed, her head tilted, and she was watching the entire sordid spectacle with a one delighted smile on her face. She was not just watching, she was savoring it. This was her coronation performed over the broken body of the previous queen. The look in her eyes was one of pure, unadulterated victory. Julian didn't stop until they were in the grand foyer. He shoved her towards the massive oak doors, releasing her hair. Elara crumpled to the floor, landing hard on her hands and knees. She was shaking uncontrollably, her scalp on fire, her mind a whirlwind of white noise. The doorman, a man named Michael, who had always greeted her with a kind smile, stood frozen in shock. Julian loomed over her, his chest heaving. His face was a contorted mask of rage. He straightened his tuxedo jacket, a bizarre gesture of normalcy in the midst of madness. "You wanted to leave," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "There's the door. Get out. Don't ever come back to my house." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and threw a few $100 bills at her feet. They fluttered down onto the pristine floor around her. "For a taxi. You're no longer my concern." With that, he turned on his heel and strode back into the ballroom, leaving her kneeling on the cold floor in her ruined gown, her hair in disarray, with nothing but the laughter of his mistress echoing in her ears. The cold of the marble floor seeped through the thin satin of her gown, a chilling reality check that this was not a dream. For a long moment, Elara remained on her hands and knees in the grand foyer of the St. Regis, unable to move. The world had tilted on its axis. The muffled sounds of the gala restarting within the ballroom, a nervous cough. The tentative restart of the orchestra were an insult to the violence that had just occurred. The doorman, Michael, finally broke his paralysis. He rushed to her side, his face a mess of concern and pity. "Mrs. Thorne? Ma'am, are you all right?" His kindness was the thing that broke her. A choked sob escaped her lips. She couldn't speak. Shame was a physical weight pressing down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. She was Elara Thorne, a woman whose photo graced society pages, a woman envied for her poise and grace. Now she was a heap on the floor, publicly discarded like trash. Michael helped her to her feet, his touch gentle and respectful. "Let me call you a car, ma'am. Please." She shook her head, unable to process the logistics of where. The Hamptons estate, the Fifth Avenue penthouse. They weren't her homes. They were his houses. He had made that brutally clear. She fumbled in her small clutch for her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip it. The scattered $100 bills on the floor felt like a final obscene gesture of his power over her. She scrolled through her contacts with a trembling thumb, past names of society, friends, who were likely already whispering about her downfall inside that ballroom. She stopped at one name, Chloe. Chloe Jensen had been her best friend in college, her maid of honor, and the one person who had always seen through Julian's glossy facade. A fiercely independent investigative journalist, Chloe had viewed Elara's marriage with loving skepticism from the start. They had drifted apart as Elara was consumed by the demands of Julian's world, but the bond was still there, a lifeline in the darkness. She pressed the call button. Chloe answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and alert. "Elara. It's after midnight. Is everything okay?" "Chloe." Elara whispered the name of a prayer. Can you come get at me?" The words shattered as she said them, and the sobs she had been holding back erupted raw and ragged. "Where are you? What happened?" Chloe's voice was instantly stripped of sleepiness, replaced by urgent concern. "The St. Regis," Elara choked out. Julian, he threw me out." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then, "I'm on my way. Don't move. I'll be there in 15 minutes. The 15 minutes felt like a lifetime. Michael discreetly led her to a small private alcove off the main foyer, shielding her from the curious glances of hotel guests. He brought her a glass of water, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to her husband's barbarism. When Chloe's familiar beat-up hatchback pulled up to the curb, it looked more beautiful to Elara than any limousine she had ever ridden in. Chloe burst out of the driver's side, her eyes taking in Elara's disheveled state, the tear-streaked face, the wild hair, the gown that looked like a costume from another life. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around Elara, holding her tight. In that embrace, 10 years of carefully constructed walls crumbled, and Elara wept. In the safety of Chloe's small, cluttered apartment in the village, an apartment filled with books, research papers, and the scent of coffee, the story came tumbling out. The affair, the confrontation, the dragging, the laughter. Chloe listened, her expression hardening from concern to a cold, simmering fury. "That monster," she said, her voice tight. "That narcissistic, abusive monster. I knew it. I always knew there was something rotten under all that polish. She handed Alara a mug of chamomile tea. First things first. You're staying here. You're safe. Second, we need to think. He won't just let this go. Chloe was right. By 2 a.m., Alara's phone began to buzz incessantly. A text from Julian's personal assistant, Mr. Thorne, has requested the immediate return of the company credit cards. A minute later, an email notification. Your access to the Thorne private banking portal has been suspended. He was cutting her off swiftly and surgically, severing every financial tie that bound them. The tear of Elysium necklace, still around her neck, suddenly felt like stolen property. He's trying to leave you with nothing, Chloe said, pacing the small living room. He thinks he can throw you out, humiliate you, and you'll just disappear. What can I do? Alara asked, her voice hollow. He has the best lawyers in the country. There's a prenup. I signed it without even reading it. I was so in love. We'll find a way around the prenup, Chloe said fiercely. They're not ironclad, especially under circumstances of public abuse and infidelity. But that's not the first move. He attacked you in public, Alara. There were hundreds of witnesses, and paparazzi. As if on cue, Chloe's laptop dinged with a news alert. She opened it, and her face went pale. She turned the screen towards Alara. It was the front page of a major online tabloid. The headline screamed, Twy Coon's tirade. Julian Thorne evicts hysterical wife, Alara, from charity gala. The lead photo was a blurry, horrific shot of Julian. His face contorted in a snarl, his hand tangled in her hair as he dragged her through the foyer. But it was the accompanying article that was the real poison. Quoting anonymous sources from inside the event, it painted Alara as an unstable, jealous wife who had caused a drunken scene after misinterpreting a friendly conversation between her husband and a young colleague. It spun Julian's violence as a desperate attempt to calmly remove his overwrought wife from the situation to save her further embarrassment. Isabella's fingerprints were all over it. It was a PR masterpiece of character assassination. They're already controlling the narrative. Alara whispered the words like acid. They're making me the villain. Of course they are. Chloe spat, slamming the laptop shut. It's what they do. They crush, they spin, they destroy. But they've made one critical mistake. Alara looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and confused. What? Chloe knelt in front of her, taking her friend's trembling hands in her own. Her eyes, usually so cynical and world-weary from her job, now burned with a fire Alara hadn't seen in years. They underestimated you, Chloe said, her voice low and intense. Julian, that crimson-clad viper, the whole world, they all think you're just a pretty fragile doll that he can break and throw away. She paused, her grip tightening. But I know who you were before him. Alara Sterling, the smartest woman in our program. The one who could outdesign, outthink, and outwork everyone. She's still in there. He didn't destroy her. He just buried her. A tiny spark flickered in the desolate landscape of Alara's heart. He thinks this is over. Chloe continued, her voice rising with conviction. He thinks he won tonight. But this isn't the end, Alara. This is the beginning. We're not going to sue him for alimony. We're not going to fight for a settlement. That's his game played on his field. We're going to do something else. What? Alara breathed. We are going to take everything, Chloe said, a dangerous smile playing on her lips. His company, his reputation, His legacy. We are going to find every skeleton in his closet, every dirty deal, every secret he's ever buried, and we're going to burn his entire empire to the ground. He dragged you out by your hair. We're going to drag him down by his crown. This is not about revenge. This is about justice. For the first time since she'd felt Julian's hand in her hair, Elara felt something other than pain and humiliation. It was a faint, unfamiliar flicker. It was hope. It was rage, and it was the first stone being laid in the foundation of a war. The days that followed were a blur of legal jargon, bitter coffee, and sleepless nights on Chloe's couch. The world outside raged with the story. Julian's PR machine, captained by Isabella, was working in overdrive. Elara was painted in the society columns as a tragic, unstable figure, while Julian was the long-suffering husband, a pillar of strength dealing with a private family matter. They even floated a narrative about her having a breakdown due to the pressures of public life. It was masterful, and it was suffocating. They're building a cage of lies around you, Chloe said, scrolling through another saccharine article praising Julian's forbearance. We need to break out, and for that, we need a bigger hammer. Chloe's connections as a journalist led them to Ava Chen, a lawyer whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence in corporate circles. Ava wasn't a divorce lawyer. She was a corporate litigator, a specialist in shareholder lawsuits and hostile takeovers. Her office was a minimalist expanse of glass and steel overlooking the financial district, a war room disguised as a workspace. Ava Chen was a woman in her late 40s with an impeccably tailored suit and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to brook no argument. She listened to Elara's story without interruption, her steepled fingers resting on a polished mahogany desk, her eyes sharp and analytical. She had already reviewed the prenuptial agreement which Chloe had managed to procure from Elara's old files. This is a fortress, Ava said, her voice calm and even, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the document. Julian's father had this drafted. It waives your right to any assets of Thorn Industries, any properties acquired before or during the marriage, and limits spousal support to a pittance contingent on a non-disclosure agreement. It's designed to ensure that a departing spouse leaves with nothing more than what they came in with. Elara's heart sank. So it's hopeless. I didn't say that, Ava corrected, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. I said it was a fortress, and every fortress has a weakness. Usually, it's the arrogance of its architect. She leaned forward. The prenup is voidable under conditions of duress or fraud, but a more potent avenue is to argue that you weren't just a wife. For 10 years, you put your own promising career on hold to become a full-time, unpaid ambassador for the Thorn brand. You hosted diplomats, charmed investors, planned events that directly led to major business deals. You weren't just a spouse, you were a strategic asset. We can argue that a significant portion of the company's growth in the last decade is tied to your unpaid emotional and social labor. We will sue for equity. It was a bold, unconventional strategy, not for a piece of his fortune, but for a piece of his company. But more importantly, Ava continued, a messy public lawsuit is the last thing Julian Thorn wants right now. And Chloe tells me, you suspect he has secrets. Elara nodded slowly. He was always secretive about the company's finances. There were trips to the Cayman Islands he claimed were for investor relations. And there was a project he was obsessed with a few years ago. The Odessa project. He sank hundreds of millions into it, something about securing new shipping routes in the Black Sea. Then it just vanished. He never spoke of it again, and I heard rumors that it was a catastrophic failure. Chloe leaned in her journalistic instincts, flaring. $100 million failure that was never reported to the shareholders. That's not just bad business. That's potential securities fraud. Exactly, Ava said. This is where we start. Chloe, you're the investigator. Dig into the Odessa project. Find out what happened, who was involved, where the money went. Elara. Your job is harder. You have to remember everything. Every name he mentioned in his sleep, every document you saw on his desk, every hushed phone call you overheard. Your memory is our treasure map. For the next few weeks, Chloe's apartment transformed into a command center. Elara, fueled by a purpose she hadn't felt in a decade, dredged up memories she had long since buried. She recalled the name of a disgruntled executive Julian had fired around the time of the Odessa project, a man named Robert Maxwell. She remembered Julian taking frantic calls from a Swiss banker named Luc Dubois. Each name was a breadcrumb. Chloe, using her research skills and a network of sources, vanished down the rabbit hole. She discovered that Robert Maxwell was now living in quiet retirement, bitter and willing to talk off the record. She found that Luc Dubois' bank had a reputation for handling discreet, high-risk transactions. The picture was still fuzzy, but the outline of something large and ugly was beginning to form. One evening, as Elara was meticulously cataloguing every social event she had hosted and cross-referencing them with Thorn Industries' stock performance, an encrypted email arrived in her inbox. The sender was anonymous. The subject line was a single word: Vanguard. Her blood ran cold. The Vanguard Gala. The night her life imploded. Hesitantly, she opened it. The message was brief. Julian Thorn is not the man you think he is, nor is he the man the board thinks he is. What he did to you was dishonorable. What he has done to the company your father helped build is a crime. Look into the shadow ledger for the Odessa project. Your father would have wanted you to know the truth. A friend of Charles Sterling. Elara stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Charles Sterling, her father. He had been a brilliant engineer who held a senior position at Thorn Industries back when Julian's father was in charge. He had helped innovate the logistics software that was still the backbone of the company. He had died of a heart attack when Elara was in college, but he had always spoken of the Thorns with respect, seeing them as titans of industry. That this friend of her father's was on the board, it was a stunning revelation. There was a secret ally, someone on the inside, watching. Chloe, Ava. She called out, her voice trembling. They crowded around the laptop. Ava read the email, her expression unreadable but intense. A shadow ledger, Ava mused. That means they were cooking the books. The Odessa project wasn't just a failure he buried. He likely used it as a cover to move money to hide losses or to pay people off. This is the key. If we can find that ledger, we don't just have leverage for a divorce settlement. We have the weapon that can bring him down in his own boardroom. But who is it? Chloe asked. Who is this friend? Elara's mind raced through the faces from the galas, the holiday parties, the weekend retreats, the older stoic members of the board. And then one face came into focus. Alistair Finch. A quiet, dignified man in his 70s, Alistair had been her father's closest colleague. He always greeted her with a sad, knowing smile, as if he saw her father's ghost standing behind her. At the Vanguard Gala just before the end, she had caught his eye. He hadn't been watching the spectacle with horror or pity, but with a look of cold, grim confirmation. "I think I know," Elara said, a newfound strength resonating in her voice. The sword was no longer just an idea. It was being forged in the fires of memory, secrets, and a hidden alliance. And Elara was beginning to feel its weight in her hand. She was no longer a victim fleeing a tyrant. She was a warrior preparing for battle. With the anonymous email as their Rosetta Stone, the investigation accelerated. The name Alistair Finch was a guarded secret between Elara, Chloe, and Ava. They knew he wouldn't risk direct contact again unless it was absolutely critical. His message was clear. He had pointed them to the weapon, but they had to find it and wield it themselves. Chloe, working her sources, discovered that the disgruntled ex-executive Robert Maxwell had been the CFO on the Odessa project before he was abruptly retired. After a series of cautious, off-the-record meetings in quiet coffee shops, Chloe's persistence wore him down. Maxwell, a man broken by Julian's ruthlessness, finally agreed to talk. He spoke of a project doomed from the start, a series of bribes to foreign officials, shell corporations set up in Panama, and massive unrecorded consulting fees paid to ghost companies. The project's official failure was a cover story. In reality, Julian had used it as a personal slush fund, siphoning off over $200 million to cover massive personal trading losses he'd incurred, and to fund his extravagant lifestyle, including the purchase of a private jet and a villa in St. Bart's, both of which he'd claimed were corporate assets. He called it creative accounting, Maxwell said, stirring his coffee with a trembling hand. I called it grand larceny. When I threatened to go to the board, he ruined me. He manufactured a performance review, accused me of incompetence, and threatened to blacklist me from the entire industry. I had a family, a mortgage. I signed the NDA and walked away. Maxwell didn't have the shadow ledger itself, but he knew how it worked. It was a completely separate set of books, maintained digitally on a highly encrypted air-gapped server in the company's Swiss data center. The only person with direct access was Julian's notoriously loyal CIO, a man named Gregory Finch, no relation to Alistair. It's a digital fortress, Chloe reported back to the war room. Getting to it is impossible without an inside man. Then we won't go through the front door, Ava declared. We'll create a crack in the wall and let the light in. Ava's strategy was twofold. Phase 1 was to apply public pressure. She drafted a legal filing. It wasn't a quiet request for divorce. It was a bombshell lawsuit. It sued not just for divorce, but for a 20% equity stake in Thorn Industries, citing Elara's decade of foundational unpaid labor that directly contributed to the company's brand value and market growth. It also formally alleged extreme emotional distress and public assault. The moment the suit was filed, it was a declaration of war. The story of the hysterical wife was immediately challenged. Elara, who had been in hiding, agreed to one carefully controlled interview with a respected, hard-hitting journalist that Chloe knew. In the interview, Elara was not the fragile, broken woman the world expected. She was composed, articulate, and strong. She didn't sling mud. She simply told her truth calmly and factually. She spoke of her architectural dreams, the subtle ways her career was sidelined, and the escalating isolation of her life. When asked about the night of the gala, she didn't cry. She looked directly into the camera. What happened that night was the culmination of years of private control and emotional abuse, she said, her voice steady. The only difference was that it happened in public. I am not a victim. I am a survivor of a toxic marriage, and I am fighting to reclaim my life and my contribution to the empire I helped build." The interview was a stunning success. Public opinion, once swayed by Julian's PR, began to shift. The hashtag, Judge I Stand With Alara, began to trend. Women's advocacy groups issued statements of support. Suddenly, Julian wasn't a long-suffering husband. He was a public abuser. The cracks in his throne began to show. Sponsors of the Vanguard Foundation started to ask questions. The company's stock took a small but noticeable dip. Julian was furious. He was used to controlling the narrative, and for the first time he had lost it. Meanwhile, Isabella was not enjoying her victory. The life she had envisioned of being the glamorous, powerful new Mrs. Thorne was being tarnished. She was now publicly seen as the other woman in a sordid abuse scandal. Society hostesses who once courted her now gave her the cold shoulder. The dream was souring, and she began to put more and more pressure on Julian. "You need to fix this," she'd shriek at him during frantic phone calls, which were gleefully reported by tabloid sources. "You promised me a kingdom, not a dumpster fire." Her panic made her reckless. Julian, under pressure from all sides, became paranoid and volatile. He started lashing out at his staff, second-guessing his executives. The atmosphere at Thorne Industries grew toxic. This was phase 2 of Ava's plan, sow internal chaos. Chloe, using Maxwell's information, crafted an anonymous, highly detailed tip and leaked it to a bulldog financial reporter at the Wall Street Sentinel, known for his tenacity. The tip didn't mention the shadow ledger, but it raised specific, pointed questions about the astronomical and unexplained losses of the Odessa project, and hinted at shareholder deception. The article that followed was an earthquake. It didn't make outright accusations, but it asked enough of the right questions to spook the market. Thorne Industries Black Sea. Black hole, the headline read. The stock dropped 5% in a single day. The board of directors, who had previously been content to let Julian handle his domestic issues, were now panicking. They called an emergency meeting. Julian was trapped. He had to reassure the board, but he couldn't reveal the truth. He was forced to lie, to obfuscate, to create a web of complex falsehoods to explain the missing funds. He blamed Maxwell. He blamed rogue contractors. He blamed geopolitical instability. It was during this time of intense pressure that Alistair Finch made his move. He knew Julian would be distracted his focus on the board and the stock price. Finch, leveraging his decades of trust and seniority, approached Gregory Finch, the CIO. He didn't accuse me. He expressed concern. He spoke about loyalty to the company, to the shareholders, and to the legacy of Julian's father. He subtly hinted that the ship was taking on water, and that every man needed to decide if he was going down with the captain. He didn't ask for the ledger. He just planted a seed of doubt in the mind of the one man who held the key. A day after the board meeting, a plain manila envelope was delivered by courier to Ava Chen's office. There was no return address. Inside was a single encrypted USB drive. Ava plugged it into a secure offline laptop. She typed in the password Alistair had sent in a second, separate encrypted message, Charles, Sterling, 1958. A spreadsheet bloomed on the screen. It was the shadow ledger, a meticulous, damning record of every illegal transaction, every bribe, every siphoned dollar. It detailed how Julian had defrauded his own company of nearly $250 million. Ava Chen looked up from the screen, a grim, triumphant smile on her face. "We've got it," she said to Alara and Chloe. "The sword is not only forged, it's razor sharp." The time for quiet maneuvering was over. The time for the final confrontation had arrived. Ava immediately began drafting a letter, not to Julian, but to each member of the Thorn Industries Board of Directors, calling for a special session to present evidence of gross financial misconduct by the CEO. The coup was about to begin. The Thorn Industries boardroom was on the 80th floor, a glass-walled chamber that offered a godlike view of the city below. It was a room built for power, with a long obsidian table, polished to a mirror shine, and 20 high-backed leather chairs. It was Julian's sanctuary, his throne room. And today it was to be his gallows. Julian entered the room with a confident stride, but the strain was visible around his eyes. He believed this emergency meeting, called by Ava Chen on behalf of a major stakeholder, was a desperate legal maneuver by Elara, a gambit to pressure him into a larger divorce settlement. He was prepared to swat it away like a fly. He nodded curtly to the board members, his gaze lingering for a second on Alistair Finch, who met his look with an unreadable, placid expression. "Let's get this farce over with," Julian announced, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I assume Ms. Chen has some trumped-up claims to waste our time with." The door opened, and Ava Chen walked in, followed by Chloe. But it was the third person who made the entire room draw a collective breath. Elara. This was not the society wife they knew. She wore a simple, elegant, dark grey sheath dress. Her hair was pulled back in a severe professional bun. The only piece of jewelry she wore was a simple gold necklace her father had given her for her 16th birthday. Gone was the timid, accommodating Mrs. Thorn. In her place stood Elara Sterling, a woman radiating a cold, focused calm that was more intimidating than any outburst. She took a seat opposite Julian, her eyes locking with him across the polished table. The flicker of shock in his eyes was her first small victory. He hadn't expected her to have the audacity to face him here in his domain. "Mr. Thorn, members of the board," Ava began, her voice crisp and clear. "We are not here to discuss a domestic dispute. We are here to discuss a matter of fiduciary duty and gross corporate malfeasance." Julian scoffed. "This is a pathetic attempt to extort money. Whatever fantasy my soon-to-be ex-wife has cooked up." "This is no fantasy, Julian," Elara said, her voice cutting through his. It was the first time she had spoken, and the sound of it, clear, strong, and devoid of fear, silenced him. Every head in the room turned to her. "For 10 years," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the board members, many of whom she had hosted in her home. "I stood by this man. I helped him build the image of Thorn Industries as a stable, respectable, family-led institution. An image I have now learned that is built on a foundation of lies." Ava Chen nodded to Chloe, who placed a sleek tablet on the table and with a few taps activated the boardroom's main screen. The shadow ledger appeared line by damning line. "What you are looking at," Ava said, "is a detailed record of the Odessa project, a project that was not a business failure, but a meticulously planned $240 million fraud perpetrated by your CEO to cover personal debts and fund a lifestyle you were told was paid for by his personal wealth." Julian's face went from ruddy to ashen. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at Alistair Finch, who simply stared back his disappointment, a palpable force in the room. He had been betrayed from the inside. "This is fabricated," Julian sputtered, slamming his fist on the table. "This is a forged document, created by a bitter, vengeful woman." "Is it?" Ava countered smoothly. "Then perhaps you can explain the wire transfers to shell corporations in Panama that match to the dollar the purchase of your villa in St. Bart's, or the payments to consultants who are in fact art dealers from whom you purchased several pieces of your private collection." We have the receipts, Mr. Thorne. We have the bank records. We have sworn testimony from your former CFO, Robert Maxwell. The board members murmured amongst themselves, their expressions shifting from skepticism to alarm. They were businessmen. They understood numbers, and the numbers on the screen told a story of catastrophic betrayal. Elara spoke again, her voice resonating with the quiet authority of truth. This isn't just about money. It's about the soul of this company. My father, Charles Sterling, helped build the software that is the heart of this empire. He believed in integrity. He believed in the Thorne name. Julian has spat on that legacy. He has risked this entire company, your company, to fuel his own greed. She then looked directly at Julian, her eyes holding no hatred, only a profound and final judgment. You thought I was just an accessory, something you could own and then discard. You tried to break me, to humiliate me, to silence me. But you forgot that I lived in your house for 10 years. I saw the late-night papers you tried to hide. I heard the hushed phone calls. I saw the fear in your eyes when the market turned. You didn't just underestimate me, Julian. You forgot I was even there. It was a fatal oversight. Alistair Finch cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. I have seen the evidence presented by Ms. Chen and Ms. Sterling, he said, his voice heavy with gravitas. I have also conducted my own internal review. The allegations are not only credible, they are undeniable. Julian Thorne has systematically defrauded this company and its shareholders. He has cancer in this boardroom. I move for a vote of no confidence and his immediate termination for cause. Another board member seconded the motion immediately. Julian looked around the table, his eyes wide with panic, searching for an ally. He found none. He saw only the cold, hard faces of businessmen cutting their losses. The vote was a formality. Unanimous. This is preposterous. You can't do this, Julian roared, rising to his feet. I am Thorne Industries. No, Alistair said, his voice like a chipping stone. You are not. You are a disgrace to your father's name. Security will see you out. You are to have no further access to this building or any company assets. 2 security guards entered the room, their presence prearranged. They stood on either side of Julian. The color drained from his face as he realized the finality of it all. His empire, his power, his identity all gone in the space of 15 minutes. As the guards escorted a stunned, sputtering Julian Thorne from the room, he passed by Elara. He stopped for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. You, he whispered venomously. You did this. Elara met his gaze without flinching. No, Julian, she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. You did this to yourself. You just thought no one was watching. He was escorted out. The door clicked shut, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. The reckoning was over. Elara Sterling had not just won her freedom, she had taken the throne. In the aftermath of the boardroom coup, the fallout was swift and spectacular. Julian Thorne's world imploded. Facing an SEC investigation and criminal fraud charges, his empire was dismantled, and his name became a synonym for corporate disgrace. The man who once commanded rooms with his presence was reduced to a grim-faced figure on the courthouse steps. Isabella Vance, whose ambition had been her driving force, vanished entirely. With Julian's assets frozen and her reputation destroyed, she disappeared from the social scene, a ghost of the life she had so desperately craved. But this story was never truly about their downfall. It was about Elara's rise. As part of a confidential settlement, Elara secured the 20% equity stake she had fought for. She didn't stay to rule over the rubble of Julian's empire. Instead, she systematically sold her shares and used the immense capital to create the Sterling Foundation, a charity dedicated to funding scholarships for women in architecture. She had won her freedom, and she was now using it to build doors for others. Leaving New York behind, she returned to her roots on the West Coast, settling in a quiet town overlooking the Pacific. There she finally built a house for herself, not a cold mansion of marble and expectation, but a warm, light-filled structure of wood and glass that embraced the rugged landscape. She opened a small but acclaimed architectural firm, Sterling and Associates, focusing on the sustainable community projects she had once dreamed of. She was no longer Elara Thorne, the tycoon's wife. She was Elara Sterling, the architect. Years later, standing on the deck of the house she built, she watched the sunset with Chloe. "Do you ever think about him?" Chloe asked gently. Elara smiled, a look of profound peace on her face. "I think of him as a lesson," she said. "A story about a man so obsessed with power, he built his own cage. But that story is over. This is my story now." The wind from the ocean caught her hair, and she didn't shield her face. The phoenix had not only risen from the ashes, she had learned to command the wind. Elara's story is a powerful reminder that the most gilded cages are still cages. It's a story about the brutal reality of hidden abuse and the terrifying power of public humiliation. But more than that, it's a story of incredible resilience. It shows that your lowest moment, the moment you feel most broken and exposed, does not have to be your ending. It can be the beginning of a battle you never knew you had the strength to fight. It proves that true power isn't about wealth or status. It's about reclaiming your own voice, your own name, and your own truth. Have you ever felt underestimated or silenced? Have you witnessed someone being judged unfairly by the court of public opinion? If Elara's journey from a discarded wife to the architect of her own destiny resonated with you, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who might need to hear a story of strength and survival. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next real-life drama. Your story matters. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
He told her she was nothing without him. He said her dreams were just paint splatters on a worthless canvas. When Serafina Vance finally found the courage to say goodbye, Gregory Dalton didn't just disagree. He laughed. A cold, cutting laugh that echoed in the crowded cafe and followed her into the street. He thought he had shattered her, but he never imagined that the broken pieces would be reassembled into a masterpiece. He never guessed that her silent struggle would capture the attention of the one man he could never impress. And he certainly never predicted he'd be watching helpless as that very man, billionaire Damian Blackwood, silenced the world and kissed her on live television. This is the story of how a single goodbye met with laughter triggered an earthquake that flattened one man's world and built an empire for the woman he threw away. The end came not with a bang, but with a condescending chuckle. It was a sound that would haunt Serafina Vance's waking moments and poison her dreams for months to come. It was the sound of her 5-year relationship, her future, and her self-worth being ground into dust under the heel of Gregory Dalton's polished leather shoe. They were sitting in the Gilded Bean, a coffee shop in downtown Ethelberg City that tried too hard to be chic and succeeded only in being expensive. It was Greg's choice, of course. Everything was always Greg's choice. The cafe, with its minimalist decor and patrons dressed in shades of gray and beige, was a perfect reflection of his life philosophy Appearance is everything. Substance was a distant optional second. Sarah, you have to be realistic, he said, stirring his overpriced macchiato with a tiny silver spoon, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. It was his classic move, the conversational checkmate, where he refused to make eye contact, signaling that her opinion was already irrelevant. My career is on an upward trajectory. I'm networking with people who matter. The partners at Sterling and Finch are watching me. I need a partner who complements that, someone who understands the landscape. Each word was a carefully chosen stiletto aimed with precision. He wasn't just breaking up with her. He was delivering a performance review of their relationship, and she had failed spectacularly. Her compliment was her paint-stained jeans, the scent of turpentine that clung to her hair, and the inconvenient, unpredictable hours of a struggling artist. The landscape he spoke of was a world of corporate galas and rooftop cocktails, a world where she felt like a poorly translated foreign film. A partner who compliments you, Serafina, repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The knot in her stomach tightened. You mean a partner who looks good on your arm at a fundraiser? Someone whose father is a board member somewhere? For the first time, Greg's eyes met hers. They were a cool, dismissive blue. It's not just about that, and it's naive of you to frame it that way. It's about shared ambitions. My ambition is to make partner before I'm 30. Your ambition is to, sell a painting for a few $100s at a street fair to feel fulfilled. He said the word fulfilled as if it were a communicable disease. The heat rose in her cheeks. For years he had feigned support for her art. He'd called it her cute little hobby. He'd attended one of her gallery shows, a small local affair, and spent the entire time on his phone texting colleagues. Now the pretense was gone, stripped away to reveal the raw contempt beneath. My art is not a hobby, Greg, she said, her voice trembling but gaining a sliver of strength. It's who I am. It's the only thing that's ever made sense to me. And that's the problem, he said, leaning back with an air of finality. He placed his cup down with a soft clink. I live in the real world, Sarah. You live in a fantasy. I can't afford to be dragged down by that anymore. It's over. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Over. A single word to erase 5 years of shared Christmases, late-night conversations, whispered secrets, and the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's rhythms. Serafina stared at him, at the handsome, manicured man she had once loved so fiercely. Now he was a stranger in a well-tailored suit. A cold wave of clarity washed over her. She had been so busy trying to fit into the corners of his life that she hadn't realized she was contorting herself into a shape that wasn't her own. She had been his artsy girlfriend, a quirky accessory he could talk about at parties. But now the accessory was outdated. It was time for an upgrade. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. She took a deep breath, gathering the tattered remnants of her dignity. Okay, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. If that's how you feel. She stood up, her worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Then, goodbye, Greg. It was meant to be a moment of quiet closure, a final sad punctuation mark. But Greg didn't see it that way. He looked up at her, a slow, incredulous smile spreading across his face. And then he laughed. It wasn't a small laugh. It was a full-throated, incredulous bark of amusement. He leaned his head back and laughed at the ceiling, at the other patrons who were now turning to stare at the utter patheticness he saw in her. He was laughing at her final simple goodbye, as if it were the punchline to a long, sad joke. The joke of her life. The joke of her ever thinking she was his equal. The sound pierced through her composure like a shard of glass. Every head in the gilded bean turned. She saw pity in some eyes, curiosity in others. But all she could hear was that laugh, a derisive, dismissive sound that told her she was a fool. A nobody he was leaving behind without a second thought. Her face burned with a humiliation so profound it felt physical. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the cafe, the sound of his laughter following her, chasing her down the street, clinging to her like the city smog. As the automatic door slid shut behind her, it cut off the sound, but it was too late. The echo was already inside her, a permanent resident in the hollowed-out chambers of her heart. He thought her goodbye was the end of a joke. He had no idea it was the beginning of her story. The first week was a blur of gray. Seraphina's apartment, once a vibrant sanctuary of color and creativity, became a tomb. Canvases, half-finished with bold strokes of cobalt and crimson, leaned against the walls like silent, mocking accusers. Her brushes sat stiffening with dried paint in jars of murky water. The very tools of her salvation now felt like instruments of her failure. Greg's laughter had become the soundtrack to her life, a phantom echo that played on a loop in the quiet of her studio. She replayed the scene in the Gilded Bean 1,000 times, each viewing more agonizing than the last. She dissected every word, every nuance of his cruelty. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had invalidated her entire existence. Her art, her passion, her very soul. He had bundled it all up, labeled it not good enough, and tossed it aside like trash. His laugh was the confirmation she was and always would be a joke. Her best friend, Olivia Chen, a sharp-witted journalist who had never trusted Greg, tried to break through the wall of her despair. She arrived on the third day with 2 large pizzas and a bottle of bourbon, kicking aside a pile of takeout containers by the door. "Okay, the official mourning period is over," Olivia announced, setting the food down on the only clear surface, a small, paint-splattered stool. "We've done wallowing, we've done crying into a pint of ice cream. Now we move on to the righteous anger phase, followed by the screw him, I'm a goddess phase." Seraphina curled up on her faded velvet sofa, barely moved. She was wearing the same sweater she'd had on for 2 days. "There's no anger left, Liv." He scooped it all out and left a hole. "Bull," Olivia said, pouring a generous amount of bourbon into 2 smudged glasses. "He didn't leave a hole. He left a construction site. You just have to decide what you're going to build. A shrine to the jerk who laughed at you, or a skyscraper so tall he'll get a crick in his neck looking up at it." She pushed a glass into Seraphina's hand. "Drink. It's for structural integrity." Forcing a weak smile, Seraphina took a sip. The bourbon burned a welcome distraction from the cold ache in her chest. For hours, Olivia let her talk, letting the poison out. Seraphina recounted every belittling comment, every dismissive gesture from the past 5 years that she had ignored or excused. The time Greg called her gallery opening quaint. The way he'd introduce her as someone who dabbles in art. The subtle, constant pressure to be smaller, quieter, less passionate, more beige, like the walls of his favorite coffee shop. "He was building his case against you for years," Olivia said, her eyes flashing with fury. "He needed to believe you were small so he wouldn't feel guilty for leaving you. It was never about you, Sarah. It was about his own pathetic ladder-climbing insecurity." Olivia's words were a lifeline, a different narrative to counter the one Greg had seared into her brain. Maybe she wasn't a joke. Maybe she was just a story he told himself. That night, after Olivia left, Seraphina couldn't sleep. The echo of laughter was still there, but now it was competing with Olivia's voice. A skyscraper so tall. She walked into her studio, the moonlight casting long shadows across the floor. Her gaze fell upon a large, untouched canvas on her main easel. It was intimidatingly white, a vast expanse of nothing. For days the sight of it had filled her with dread. But now something shifted. The blankness was no longer an absence. It was a possibility. A new feeling began to bubble up from the depths of her despair, hot and sharp. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was rage, a furious, cleansing fire. Rage at Greg, rage at the world that celebrated men like him, and most of all, rage at herself for ever letting him dim her light. She grabbed a stick of charcoal, her hand shaking. The laughter was still there, but she would make it part of the art. She would not build a shrine to her pain. She would build a monument out of it, an architecture of ruin. She began to sketch her movements, frantic, desperate. She drew the distorted, laughing mouth of a man, a gaping maw of derision. She drew a fractured cityscape, buildings crumbling into dust. She drew a lone, small figure, not cowering but standing amidst the debris with cracks of gold like kintsugi running through her form. It was messy, chaotic, and raw. It was everything she felt. Days turned into a week, then 2. She barely ate, barely slept. She poured every ounce of her humiliation, her anger, and her grief onto that canvas. She mixed colors that were jarring and unsettling, sickly yellows, deep bruised purples, furious slashes of crimson. It was not a pretty painting. It was a visceral scream. One rain-slick Tuesday, while scrolling aimlessly online during a forced break for coffee, she saw it. A small, almost hidden advertisement. The Blackwood Grant for Visionary Artists. The prize was a staggering $100,000 and a solo exhibition at the prestigious Ethelberg Museum of Modern Art. It was sponsored by Blackwood Enterprises, the sprawling conglomerate owned by the city's most enigmatic and powerful figure, Damian Blackwood. He was a ghost, a legend, a man who had built a global empire from nothing before he was 35. He was notoriously private, rarely photographed, and his company was known for its ruthless efficiency and groundbreaking innovation. Sponsoring an art grant seemed strangely out of character. The deadline was in 3 days. It was impossible. A pipe dream. Thousands of artists far more talented and established than her would be applying. It was the kind of thing Greg would have scoffed at, another one of her unrealistic fantasies. And that was exactly why she had to do it. With trembling hands, she filled out the online application. She wrote an artist's statement, not the polished academic nonsense she usually cobbled together, but a raw, honest paragraph about channeling personal devastation into a creative force. For the submission photos, she documented her work in progress, the chaotic, furious painting she had started calling Phoenix. As she clicked the submit button minutes before the midnight deadline, she didn't feel hopeful. She didn't feel confident. She felt a quiet sense of defiance. It wasn't about winning. It was about taking the ugliest sound she had ever heard and trying to turn it into something of her own. It was a final, silent act of rebellion against the man who thought her goodbye was a joke. She was taking her pain, and she was signing her name to it. The weeks that followed the submission were a return to a new kind of normal. The inferno of creativity that had consumed Serafina died down to a low simmer. She finished Phoenix, and the final result was both terrifying and beautiful. It was a maelstrom of color and emotion, the laughing mouth barely visible beneath layers of defiant light, the fractured figure at its center, not broken but remade. It was the best, most honest work she had ever done. She hid it in the back of her studio, facing the wall, unable to decide if it was a masterpiece or a monstrosity. She took on small commissions, pet portraits, bland landscapes for corporate offices, just to pay the rent. Each paid bill was a small victory, a quiet refutation of Greg's assertion that she couldn't survive without him. She avoided the Gilded Bean and the parts of the city they used to frequent, creating a new map of her life, one that didn't have his shadow cast over it. She had almost forgotten about the Blackwood Grant. It was a lottery ticket she'd bought in a moment of desperate defiance, and like most lottery tickets, she assumed it had already been thrown away, a worthless piece of paper. The confirmation email had been swallowed by her junk folder, and she had moved on. Rejection, after all, was an old and familiar friend to an artist. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon 6 weeks after the breakup, an email landed in her inbox. It was sleek and minimalist, bearing the simple, imposing logo of Blackwood Enterprises. The subject line read, "Regarding your submission to the Blackwood Grant." Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The polite, formulaic rejection. "Thank you for your interest. We received an overwhelming number of exceptional submissions. Unfortunately." She took a deep breath and clicked it open. But the words she expected weren't there, dear Ms. Vance. On behalf of the Blackwood Grant Selection Committee, I am delighted to inform you that your submission, Phoenix has been selected as one of the 10 finalists. Your work demonstrated a unique and compelling voice that resonated deeply with the judges. The final selection will be made during the Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala on October 7th. As a finalist, you and a guest are cordially invited to attend. Further details regarding the event and the presentation of your work will follow in a separate communication. Sincerely, Alistair Harrison, Director. The Blackwood Foundation. Serafina read the email once, then a second time, then a third. Her hands started to shake. Finalist. Her. It felt like a clerical error, a glitch in the system. She checked the recipient address. It was definitely hers. She read the name, Alistair Harrison. A quick search revealed him to be Damien Blackwood's right-hand man, a formidable figure often referred to in business journals as Blackwood's shadow. This was real. A dizzying, terrifying wave of elation washed over her. She jumped up from her chair, a strangled cry of disbelief escaping her lips. She had to tell someone. She immediately called Olivia. "You're not going to believe this," Serafina said, her voice breathless. "Let me guess." Olivia deadpanned. "Greg called begging for you to take him back because his new high society girlfriend realized he has the personality of a damp spreadsheet." "Better?" Serafina laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt foreign in her own mouth. "I'm a finalist for the Blackwood Grant." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a shriek so loud Serafina had to pull the phone away from her ear. "No, the Damien Blackwood Grant. The $100,000 life-changing Screw You Greg Grant. Sarah, that's not just better. That's a Hollywood movie ending." The excitement was intoxicating, but a sliver of cold dread quickly followed. The gala. A high-profile event filled with the exact kind of people Greg had always aspired to be. The elite of Ethelberg City. She would have to stand in a room full of them, her raw, painful art displayed for their judgment. And what would she wear? The nicest thing she owned was a dress she'd bought for a Christmas party with Greg's parents 2 years ago. The official invitation arrived a few days later, a thick card of impossibly elegant cream stock, the Blackwood crest embossed in silver at the top. It was an artifact from another universe. The gala would be held at the Grand Imperial Ballroom, a place so exclusive Serafina had only ever seen it in magazines. As the date approached, a quiet narrative began to build in the city's art blogs and society pages. The Blackwood Grant in its inaugural year was the talk of the town. The 10 finalists were announced publicly, and Serafina's name was on a list alongside critically acclaimed artists, sculptors, and photographers. She felt like an imposter. An article in the Ethelberg Chronicle profiled the finalists. When they got to her, they noted she was a relative unknown, and the description of her piece was vague based on the artist's statement she'd submitted. Vance's work, Phoenix, is said to be a deeply personal exploration of destruction and rebirth. Serafina wondered who exactly had championed her work. Who on that anonymous committee had seen past the rage and the grief to find something they called a compelling voice? In her mind, the judges were a faceless council of austere art critics. She never once considered that the whisper in the machine, the person who had plucked her application from a digital slush pile of thousands, could have been the machine's architect himself. Damien Blackwood was an abstraction, a name synonymous with power. He was a modern-day Howard Hughes, a billionaire recluse who shaped the world from the top floor of his unbreachable glass tower. The media portrayed him as cold, calculating, and utterly untouchable. There was no way a man like that would be personally involved in sifting through art submissions. And yet, in a sterile white office overlooking the city, Damien Blackwood stood before Serafina's painting. After the finalists were chosen by the committee, he had requested all 10 pieces be brought to his private gallery in Blackwood Tower. Mr. Harrison had overseen the delivery, ensuring the utmost discretion. Now he stared at Phoenix. He wasn't looking at it as an investment or a piece of decor. He saw the story inside it, He saw the fury in the brushstrokes, the despair in the bruised purples, and the stubborn, defiant glint of gold in the cracks of the broken figure. He saw more than just the end of a relationship. He saw a battle for a soul. This one, he said, his voice quiet, directed at Mr. Harrison, who stood silently by the door. "What do you know about the artist?" Seraphina Vance Harrison replied, consulting his tablet. 28. No major gallery representation. A few small group shows, some minor commissions. Lives in a walk-up in the Arts District. According to her statement, the piece was inspired by a recent difficult personal event. Damien stepped closer to the canvas, his sharp eyes tracing the chaotic lines of the laughing mouth that was almost but not quite obliterated. He knew that look. He had seen it before on the faces of dismissive investors and condescending rivals in his early days. He knew the unique sting of being laughed at by someone who believed they were your superior. He had built his entire empire on the foundation of that sting. A difficult personal event, Damien mused, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. She didn't just paint her pain, Harrison. She weaponized it. He turned away from the canvas. "Make sure Ms. Vance is well taken care of at the gala. I want to meet her." The night of the gala arrived like a tidal wave of anxiety and anticipation. Seraphina stood in front of her full-length mirror, turning slowly. Olivia had worked magic, calling in a favor from a stylist friend to procure a dress Seraphina could never have afforded. It was a deep emerald green, a simple, elegant column of silk that clung in all the right places. It was more sophisticated than anything she had ever worn, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like an imposter. She felt formidable. "See," Olivia said, zipping up the back. "Skyscraper, not a shrine." Arriving at the Grand Imperial Ballroom was like stepping into another dimension. Crystal chandeliers the size of cars dripped from a cavernous frescoed ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of powerful conversations. Waiters in crisp white jackets weaved through the throngs of Ethelberg's elite, balancing trays of champagne and impossibly delicate canapes. Seraphina's painting Phoenix was displayed on a freestanding wall in a cordoned-off area with the other 9 finalists' work. Seeing it there professionally lit and surrounded by such opulence was surreal. It looked angrier and more vibrant than it had in her dusty apartment, a splash of raw, chaotic emotion in a room of curated perfection. She felt a surge of pride, quickly followed by a wave of intense vulnerability. It was like her diary had been opened for the world to read. She and Olivia found a small table near the edge of the room, nursing their glasses of champagne and watching the spectacle. "I feel like I'm in a nature documentary," Olivia whispered. "Observe the titans of industry in their natural habitat. Notice the ceremonial displays of wealth and the ritualistic exchange of business cards." Seraphina laughed, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. And then she saw him. Gregory Dalton. He was standing near the center of the room, holding court with a small group of men in tuxedos. He looked perfectly at home, exuding the effortless confidence of a man who knew he belonged. And on his arm was a woman with blonde, perfectly coiffed hair and a dress that sparkled with what looked like real diamonds. Seraphina recognized her from the society pages. Victoria Lancaster, daughter of Charles Lancaster, the senior managing partner at Sterling & Finch. Greg's boss. Of course. This was the compliment. This was the upgrade. A cold, familiar dread washed over her. The ballroom suddenly felt very small and very hot. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the anonymity of her quiet life. "Don't you dare," Olivia hissed, sensing her panic. "You have just as much right to be here as he does. More even. You were invited for your talent. He's here because he's dating the boss's daughter. You're an artist. He's an accessory." Olivia's words were a shot of adrenaline. She was right. Seraphina straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and took a deliberate sip of champagne. She would not let him ruin this night for her. But fate, it seemed, had a flair for the dramatic. As Greg and Victoria made their way through the crowd, their path led them directly toward the finalists' art display. Seraphina's heart leaped into her throat. He was going to see it. He was going to see her painting. Greg barely glanced at the first few pieces, his attention focused on schmoozing. But Victoria stopped, her eyes scanning the art with a look of polite boredom. Then her gaze landed on Phoenix. She paused, her head tilting. "Well, this one's aggressive," Victoria commented, her voice carrying easily in a lull in the conversation. Greg turned a dismissive smile on his face, ready to agree with whatever she said. His eyes followed hers to the canvas, and then he froze. The smile vanished. The color drained from his face. He would recognize Serafina's style anywhere, the frenetic energy of her brushwork. He stared at the canvas, his eyes slowly piecing together the imagery, the crumbling city, the fractured figure, and at its heart, buried but still terrifyingly visible, the distorted, mocking laugh. His laugh. He knew with a sickening certainty that this painting was about him. His head snapped up, his eyes scanning the crowd frantically. And then he saw her, standing not 20 feet away, looking stunning in an emerald dress, watching him. Their eyes locked across the crowded room. In his she saw pure, unadulterated shock, a dawning horror. In her own she hoped he saw nothing but cool indifference. Victoria, oblivious, tugged at his arm. "Gregory, darling, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." Before he could answer, he saw Serafina. He broke away from Victoria, a thunderous expression on his face, and began striding toward her. Olivia stood up, ready to run interference, but Serafina put a hand on her arm. "I've got this," she said, her voice calm. Greg stopped in front of their table, his face a mask of fury. "What the hell is this, Sarah?" he hissed, keeping his voice low but dripping with venom. "What is that painting?" "You're trying to humiliate me." "I'm not trying to do anything," Greg, Serafina replied, her voice even. "I painted my feelings. It's what artists do. You of all people should know that I was going through a difficult personal event." She threw his own dismissive phrasing back at him. "This is a private matter. You don't air our dirty laundry in public at an event like this." He seethed. "You think this is some kind of clever revenge? It's pathetic. It's childish." "Is it?" Serafina asked, a strange sense of calm settling over her. The fear was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. "You laughed at me in a public cafe, Greg. You humiliated me in front of dozens of strangers. My canvas is my public space. The only difference is my expression might win me $100,000. Your expression just made you look like a bully." Greg was momentarily speechless, his jaw working silently. He glanced back at Victoria, who was now watching them with a frown, her arms crossed. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. "You'll regret this," he finally spat out. "You'll always be a struggling, second-rate artist, splashing your sad little feelings onto a canvas for pocket money. Don't think some fluke nomination changes who you are." He turned on his heel and walked back to his new girlfriend, his back rigid. Serafina watched him go, but his words didn't sting. They sounded hollow, desperate. The desperate flailing of a man who had just realized the woman he'd written off as a joke was suddenly sharing a stage with him, and the spotlight wasn't on him. The reckoning had begun. The evening wore on, a symphony of clinking glasses and polite applause as various awards were presented and charitable donations were announced. Serafina remained at her table, a silent observer. Her confrontation with Greg had left her feeling strangely detached, as if she were watching a movie of her own life. He and Victoria had moved to the far side of the ballroom, but she could feel his eyes on her periodically, a glare hot with resentment. Finally, the moment arrived. The host for the evening, a celebrated art critic named Alistair Finch, no relation to Greg's firm, a fact for which Serafina was grateful, stepped up to the podium. And now Finch announced, his voice booming through the ballroom, the moment we have all been waiting for. The presentation of the inaugural Blackwood Grant for Visionary Artists. A polite hush fell over the crowd. The 10 finalists, Serafina included, were asked to stand. A spotlight swept across them, and she felt 1,000 pairs of eyes settle on her. She could see Greg staring, his expression a mixture of contempt and anxiety. He wanted her to lose. He needed her to lose. For her to fail would be a validation of his decision to leave her, proof that he had been right about her all along. This grant was created to honor an artist with a singular, uncompromising vision. Finch continued. An artist who is not afraid to explore the depths of the human experience and bring back something raw, powerful, and true. To present the award, it is my great honor to introduce the man whose vision made this all possible. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Damian Blackwood. A wave of whispers and murmurs rippled through the room. A personal appearance by Damian Blackwood was exceedingly rare. He was the invisible hand that guided the city, not a public figure who graced stages. From a side entrance he emerged. He was taller than Serafina had imagined, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that seemed to absorb the light around him. He moved with an unnerving stillness, his presence instantly commanding the entire room. He had dark hair, sharp features, and intense, penetrating eyes that swept over the audience with an unnerving lack of expression. He didn't smile or wave. He simply walked to the podium, and the world fell silent. He shook Alistair Finch's hand and turned to the microphone. "Good evening," he said. His voice was deep and resonant, a quiet force that didn't need to be loud to be heard. "My foundation is proud to support the arts, not merely as decoration, but as a necessary vital force. Art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. It should tell the stories we are too afraid to speak aloud." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. Serafina felt his gaze pass over her, but it was impossible to read his expression. He seemed to be looking through everyone at something else entirely. "This year," he continued, "we received thousands of submissions, works of incredible talent and skill. But the purpose of this grant is not just to reward skill. It is to reward courage." His eyes drifted over to the display of the finalists' work. He gestured toward them. One of these pieces in particular did not just tell a story. It wrestled with it. It is a work of profound, chaotic, and ultimately triumphant resilience. It is a painting about being shattered and refusing to stay broken. It depicts the architecture of ruin not as an endpoint, a tomb, but as the foundation for something new, something stronger. Serafina's breath caught in her throat. Architecture of ruin, the phrase she had used in her own private journal. It couldn't be. Greg was shifting on his feet, his face pale. He knew which painting Blackwood was describing. Everyone in the room was turning to look at the art, trying to guess. "This piece is not polite," Blackwood said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in. "It is not easy to look at. It is a scream rendered in oil and pigment. But it is also a testament to the fact that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths, that from the ashes of humiliation a phoenix can and must rise." He picked up the heavy crystal award from the podium. "The winner of the inaugural Blackwood Grant is Serafina Vance for her work, Phoenix." The name struck the room like a thunderclap. A smattering of polite applause quickly swelled into a genuine ovation. Olivia was screaming, pulling a stunned Serafina into a fierce hug. Time seemed to slow down. The faces in the crowd blurred. The only thing she could see clearly was Greg. He was completely still, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips, his face a perfect blank mask of utter disbelief. Victoria was staring at him, then at Serafina, then back at him, the pieces visibly clicking into place in her mind. Somehow Serafina's legs carried her forward through the tables toward the stage. The applause was a deafening roar in her ears. She felt like she was floating. As she ascended the small set of stairs, Damian Blackwood watched her. His expression still unreadable, but his eyes held an intensity that seemed to pin her in place. He handed her the award. It was heavy, solid. Real. "Thank you," she managed to whisper to him, her voice choked with emotion. He simply nodded, then gestured toward the microphone. She took a shaky breath, looking out at the sea of faces. I don't know what to say." She began, her voice trembling. "This painting. It came from a very dark place. I made it because I had to, not because I ever thought it would bring me here. To anyone out there who has ever been made to feel small or worthless, or who has been told their passion is a joke, please don't listen. Your voice matters. Your story is worth telling." She looked down at the award in her hands. "Thank you. This changes everything." The applause thundered again. Overwhelmed, she turned to leave the stage, her mind a whirlwind of shock and gratitude. Her night was complete. Her victory was absolute. But the story was not over yet. As Serafina turned to descend the stairs, a hand gently touched her elbow, stopping her. It was Damien Blackwood. She looked at him confused. He leaned in, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "One more moment, Miss Vance, if you'll permit me." Before she could process what he meant, he guided her back toward the center of the stage, keeping a light but firm grip on her arm. He stepped back to the microphone, and the expectant hush returned to the ballroom. Every phone was out, every camera lens trained on the stage. As Ms. Vance so eloquently stated, Damien began, his voice calm and measured, yet it filled the vast space with an undeniable authority. "Her story is worth telling." He turned his head slightly to look directly at her. "Her art speaks of a profound strength forged in the face of derision. It's a story of value being unrecognized by those too blind or too arrogant to see it." A cold premonition trickled down Serafina's spine. This was no longer just about the art. He was making a statement. Out in the audience, Greg Dalton felt a knot of pure dread tighten in his stomach. Every word from Blackwood's mouth felt like a perfectly aimed dart striking him with pinpoint accuracy. Victoria was no longer looking at him with confusion. Her expression had hardened into one of cold, dawning fury. She understood now. The aggressive painting, the public confrontation, Serafina's emotional acceptance speech, it all pointed to him. He was the villain in the story everyone was now watching unfold. Damien Blackwood's gaze swept across the audience, and for a fleeting moment, Serafina was certain his eyes paused on Greg. "In this city," Damien continued, his tone turning icy, "we often mistake noise for importance. We mistake arrogance for confidence. We mistake laughter for power. True power lies in creation. True strength lies in resilience." He turned his full attention back to Serafina. He looked at her not as an abstract winner, but as a person. For the first time, she saw something beyond the cold, intimidating facade. She saw a flicker of respect, of understanding. It was as if he could see the entire painful journey that had brought her to this stage. "This grant is not a gift, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice now softer, yet still broadcast to the entire room and the thousands watching the live stream. "It is an acknowledgement, a declaration that your voice will not be silenced. Your talent will not be dismissed." Then he did something no one could have ever predicted. He raised a hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. The ballroom fell into a state of suspended animation. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. "And it is a story," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that the microphone still caught perfectly, "that deserves to be celebrated." And then Damien Blackwood, the untouchable, enigmatic titan of industry, leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a passionate Hollywood kiss. It was something far more potent. It was deliberate, gentle, and utterly public. It was a kiss of coronation. A silent, definitive statement broadcast on every screen. It was a gesture that said, "She is with me. She is valued. She is protected." A collective gasp went through the audience. 1,000 flashes from cameras and phones erupted, creating a strobe effect that made the moment feel both eternal and fleeting. The world exploded in a silent cacophony of light. For Serafina, time stopped. The warmth of his lips, the faint scent of expensive cologne, and something uniquely him, the surprising gentleness in his touch, it all coalesced into a single surreal point in time. It was a moment of profound and absolute vindication, and across the room, Gregory Dalton froze. He wasn't just surprised, he was catatonic. His mind, which had been racing to do damage control, simply shut down. The world had tilted on its axis. The woman he had discarded, the pathetic little artist he had literally laughed out of his life, was not only being celebrated, but was being publicly claimed by the most powerful man in the city. The one man Gregory and every other ambitious suit in the room would have killed to even get a meeting with. His hand, which was still holding his champagne flute, went slack. The delicate crystal slipped from his grasp. It seemed to fall in slow motion, tumbling end over end, before shattering on the polished marble floor. The sharp crack of the glass was shockingly loud in the stunned silence that followed the kiss. That sound, the sound of something expensive and fragile breaking, was the sound of Gregory Dalton's entire world imploding. The derisive laugh from the cafe, the one that had haunted Serafina for months, now echoed in his own mind. But it wasn't his laugh anymore. It was the universe laughing at him, at his pathetic ambition, at his colossal, life-altering misjudgment. On stage, Damien pulled back slowly, his eyes never leaving Serafina's. The applause that erupted was tentative at first, then thunderous, a wave of shock and excitement rolling through the ballroom. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then with the same quiet dignity with which he had arrived, he turned and walked off the stage, leaving Serafina standing alone in the spotlight, the shattered remnants of her old life glittering at her feet. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic blur. As soon as Serafina stepped off the stage, she was swarmed. Not by reporters, Damien Blackwood's security team materialized as if from the shadows, forming a seamless, impenetrable barrier around her. At their head was the stern-faced Mr. Harrison. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice a calm island in the sea of noise. "Mr. Blackwood has arranged a car for you. Please come with me." He led her through a private exit away from the flashing cameras and the cacophony of questions. She caught one last glimpse of the ballroom. Greg was being confronted by a furious Victoria Lancaster, her face contorted in a mask of pure rage. People were staring, whispering, pointing. His public humiliation was absolute and complete. He wasn't just the man whose ex-girlfriend had won a prestigious award. He was the man who had become a footnote in a much larger, more shocking story. A story that was already spreading across the internet like wildfire. Serafina was ushered into the back of a black, impossibly luxurious sedan. The doors closed, sealing her in a cocoon of silence and soft leather. She was alone with her thoughts, the heavy crystal award on the seat beside her, the kiss. It replayed in her mind a vivid electric shock. It hadn't felt like a whim. It had felt calculated, a strategic move on a chessboard she hadn't even known she was playing on. The car didn't take her home. It glided through the city streets to Blackwood Tower, the monolithic glass and steel spire that dominated the Ethelberg skyline. Mr. Harrison led her to a private elevator that ascended with terrifying speed and silence, opening directly into a sprawling penthouse apartment. The space was minimalist and vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking, godlike view of the entire city. Damien Blackwood was standing by the window, his back to her, looking down at the glittering sprawl below. He had removed his tuxedo jacket and his tie, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to his forearms. He turned as she entered. In the soft light of the penthouse, he looked less like a formidable icon and more like a man. A very intense, very complicated man. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice softer than it had been on stage. "Please, have a seat. Can I get you a drink? Water. Something stronger." "Water would be fine. Thank you." She managed her voice barely a whisper. She sat on the edge of a large white sofa, placing the award on the glass coffee table in front of her. He poured her a glass of water from a crystal decanter and handed it to her, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. She felt a jolt of electricity. He sat in an armchair opposite her, creating a space of intimacy that felt both comfortable and deeply intimidating. For a long moment he was silent, simply studying her. I imagine you have questions, he finally said. One or two, she admitted, finding a sliver of her own voice. Why the grant, I understand. But that. She didn't need to say the kiss. It hung in the air between them, shimmering and unexplained. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze direct and unflinching. My mother was an artist, he said, and the simple admission seemed to cost him something. She was brilliant. Far more talented than I am in my own field. But my father, he was a practical man. He saw her passion as a frivolous hobby, a distraction from her duties as a wife and mother. He dismissed her. He patronized her. Sometimes in front of his important friends he would laugh at her dreams. The word laugh landed in the center of the room like a stone. Serafina's breath hitched. She died 10 years ago. Damien continued, his voice low and even, but underscored with a current of old deep pain. She never had a solo exhibition. She never sold a single painting. She died believing her voice didn't matter. I started this grant in her memory. When I saw your submission, your painting, your statement, I didn't just see your story, Ms. Vance. I saw hers. It all clicked into place. The grant, the personal investment, the raw emotion he'd recognized in her work. He wasn't her savior. He was a son trying to right a karmic wrong decades too late. The man you were with tonight? He said, his tone shifting, becoming sharper, more clinical. Gregory Dalton. I've encountered him in a professional capacity. He works for Charles Lancaster, a man whose business ethics are flexible. Men like them, men who see people as assets or liabilities, as stepping stones to be used and discarded. I have a particular distaste for them. They remind me of my father. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. What I did tonight was not for him. It was for you. And for my mother. It was a statement that talent like yours will not be relegated to the shadows. It will not be laughed out of the room. It will be brought into the light and put on center stage where it belongs. He was giving her context, not an apology. It was a strategic alliance, an alignment of purpose. The kiss was a public execution of one man's arrogance and a public coronation of her talent. It was a gambit, and he had played it perfectly. So it was a statement, she said, processing it all. It was, he confirmed. But that doesn't mean it wasn't sincere. He held her gaze, and she saw it again, that flicker of genuine, profound respect. Your work is magnificent, Serafina, and this is only the beginning. He gestured around the vast, empty walls of the penthouse. The grant and the exhibition are yours, of course, but I would also like to offer you a private commission. A large one. Fill this space. Paint whatever you want. I will pay you double the grant prize. Your only constraint is your own imagination. $100,000 had been life-changing. An additional $200,000 plus a commission with no constraints from a patron like Damien Blackwood. It was a different galaxy. It was freedom, the kind of freedom she had never even allowed herself to dream of. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of overwhelming cathartic release. The ghost of Gregory's laughter, the specter that had haunted her for so long, finally completely faded away. It was replaced by the quiet, resonant voice of the man sitting in front of her, a man who didn't just see her art, but understood the soul within it. She didn't leave his apartment until dawn. They talked for hours about art, about ambition, about the ghosts that drive people. When his car dropped her off at her small, humble apartment building, the world felt new. 2 weeks later, Serafina stood in the center of a massive new studio space in a renovated downtown loft, the first purchase she made with her winnings. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The space was filled with brand-new top-of-the-line supplies and a dozen enormous blank canvases. It was a kingdom of possibility. Her phone buzzed. It was a news alert from a financial journal. Gregory Dalton resigns from Sterling and Finch amid personal scandal. Sources say his engagement to Victoria Lancaster has also been terminated. She read the headline, felt a brief distant echo of what was, and then deleted the notification. He was a chapter in a book she had already finished reading. She turned to the largest canvas propped up on a heavy-duty easel in the center of the room. It was huge, intimidating, and gloriously pristinely white. It was not an absence, but an invitation. Her future was no longer something to be endured, but something to be created. With a smile, she picked up a piece of charcoal, the familiar weight a comfort in her hand. Her past was a finished piece, a phoenix of ash and fire. But this new canvas, this was her masterpiece yet to come. And this time, she would be the only one holding the brush. Serafina's story is a powerful reminder that our lowest moments can become the foundation for our greatest triumphs. The laughter that was meant to break her became the fuel for her fire. She didn't just get revenge. She reclaimed her worth, her art, and her future, proving that the best response to being dismissed is to build an empire so vast they can no longer ignore you. Her journey from a tear-streaked goodbye to a billionaire's kiss on live TV shows that true value is never determined by those who leave us, but by the strength we find within ourselves when we are left alone. If this story of resilience and spectacular vindication moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own power. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories of struggle, triumph, and the sweet, sweet justice of turning pain into power. Thank you for listening.